you keep driving past exits. Like, what hospital are you going to? Growing up in the 80s, there was a lot of car culture on television and in movies. I was a big fan of the Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider, then there was movies like the Blues Brothers, and another one that really stood out was the Cannonball Run. Just the sound of that black Lamborghini Countach, just playing cat and mouse and toying with that police car at the beginning was just something that was like stuck in my mind. So as time went on, I found that the Cannonball Run movies were actually based around a real event. And the first Cannonball Run movie was actually a lot to do with the last cannonball in 1979. Particularly one vehicle that was used in the 1979 Cannonball Run race was the Transcon Medivac. It was an orange and white ambulance that had a souped up 440 engine and upgraded suspension and these kind of things. As modern Cannonball fans, we think of cars like Alex Roy and Ed Bullion had, these European Autobahn cars. Well, back in the 70s when the Cannonball first came out, vans were all the rage. Actually, the first vehicle on the first Cannonball, when Brock Yates wanted to try out his idea of this Cannonball, he used Moon Trash, which was a 1970 Dodge van. Other vans that have run the Cannonball include the Polish Driving Association, when they had the 71 Chevy with 5 55-gallon drums of fuel in the back. Then, of course, it all culminated on the last Cannonball in 1979 when Brock Yates devised this idea to run in a modified ambulance. And Brock Yates' co-driver for this run was none other than Hal Needham. They ran this van from the Goodwives Shopping Center in Connecticut to Redondo Beach. Their ploy was to have a patient in the back and an actual doctor riding along. So they found some crack doctor, and then they had Pamela on the gurney, who would later become Brock Yates' wife. So there they are, barreling down the turnpike at like 120 miles an hour with the red lights blazing on a modified ambulance that sounds like a NASCAR. They see some police lights behind them, so they get pulled over. So naturally, I can only imagine what's going through their minds, that they're only in New Jersey and they're already getting pulled over and they're running a fake ambulance in a transcontinental race. Well, they were pulled over by 2 New Jersey officers, and they came to the car and they asked, we've been following you and you keep driving past exits. Like, what hospital are you going to? So they answered, well, we're transporting the senator's wife to the UCLA Medical Center in California. And the cops kind of look at each other and ask, well, why aren't you flying her? So this crack doctor comes up with the reason that they had to transport her via the ambulance to California was she had a rare disease where her body would come out with cysts if she was in a pressurized cabin. So the police officers went back to their car to kind of discuss what to do with these guys. And the one officer said, they're clearly lying and up to something. And his supervisor, who was driving, said, well, what if they're not lying? I think we'd be better off just letting them go, because I don't know what we would get ourselves into if this story happens to be true. So part of my involvement with this underground cannonballing society is hearing about different cannonball type events and goings on in the cannonball world. And one of these was the Cannonball reunion being held in Greenwich, Connecticut. So the minute I heard that there's going to be a bunch of ex-cannonballers from the 70s telling tales of the runs back then, I immediately booked my flight. Modern cannonballers like Alex Roy and Dave Maher, Ed Bullion were going to be there, and Pam Yates, Brock Yates' wife, and basically anybody else that who had ever run the Cannonball who was still able to be reached or was still living. And every time I would turn around, I would meet and talk to another person who was now my newest hero that had done the runs back in the 70s. So there were cars there like Alex Roy's M5, a 79 Malibu 9C1 Police Interceptor, Porsche 911, there was a Mercedes from the US Express, but the vehicle that stuck out the most was the replica of the Transcon Medivac, probably the most accurate representation out there, built by Travis Bell, who is probably most well known for being involved with the Dukes of Hazzard General Lee replicas that he's built. I was over there talking with Travis Bell and Captain Chaos, and I meet this kind of soft-spoken older gentleman whose name is Mark Fenich. And we started talking about Cannonball and this and that, and he comes to tell me that he was one of the police officers that pulled over the Transcon Medivac back in 1979 in New Jersey. So Mark went on to tell me how he and his supervisor had pulled over the Transcon Medivac in New Jersey and were wondering why this ambulance is going 120 miles an hour with its lights on and passing every exit. So they pulled them over and were told that, well, they're carrying the senator's wife, who cannot be transported to the UCLA Medical Center in an airplane because she would break out in cysts from the pressurized cabin. So him and the supervisor went back to the car and were discussing, well, what do we do with them? And Mark was telling his supervisor, he's like, well, they're clearly lying. And the supervisor said, well, yeah, most likely, but what if they're not? What kind of trouble are we going to get into if they are telling the truth? So after much deliberation, they decided to let them go. 4 months later, Mark tells me that the way he found out what really had happened was the article on the Cannonball run that came out in Time magazine. And that's when he realized that he had been had. And even worse, and adding insult to injury, was it was depicted in the 1981 movie about the same incident. So despite knowing this now that he had been had, he actually didn't meet Brock Yates again until 2001. And the way that he actually got in contact with Brock was an episode on Barry McGuire's Car Crazy, where Barry McGuire had Pam and Brock Yates on and were talking about the Cannonball run and talking about the Transcon Medivac and getting pulled over and how it tied in with the movie. And at the end of that show, Barry McGuire looked at the camera and said, if you're one of those police officers that pulled over Pam and Brock in this Transcon Medivac, please reach out to me. I would love to connect you. Well, Mark was watching that show, and that's how he got connected with Brock and Pam.